Just great. Welcome everyone to the first in a series of webinars that Greater Washington will be putting on over the next few months. My name is Alex Baca. I'm the policy manager. Our first guest for this series is Leah Brooks, who is the, Leah, make sure I get your title right, Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Trachtenberg School at George Washington University. A few notes on this. Leah has a really awesome slide deck. So right after I sort of make these administrative remarks, I'm going to turn this over to her. She's going to present. We have a ton of people in here, which is again really amazing. So thank you so much for being here. Put questions in the chat. I believe it's set up to so that the panelists can see it, although it's not public. So I know that sometimes public chats foster a lot of conversation and back and forth. For this, just because you don't see people comment, like making comments, doesn't mean that people don't have questions. So please, please, please send yours in a message if you have them. I'll direct them to Leah and sort of roll them all up and get them moving. I have a few questions of my own, and I'm super looking forward to hearing what Leah has to say about the, I guess, 2022 State of the Capital Region, which is on transportation, which is the reason that we're all here. So thank you so much. And Leah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks a ton for having me. I'm excited to be here. So I titled the State of the Capital Region Transportation a Work in Progress, first because transportation is always a work in progress, and second because we haven't actually written our report yet. So these are, you can think of these as interim reports and look forward to our report in the spring. So let me say a few things just as a lead up. In addition to being a professor at the Trachtenberg School at George Washington, I'm the director of the University's Center for Washington Area Studies. And the mission of the center is to improve the lives of people in Greater Washington, in the Greater Washington area, by studying neighborhoods and communities of our region. And as part of doing that, we've written an annual, and we is me, with co-authors from Georgetown, the American Enterprise Institute, Brookings, and Fannie Mae, annual reports on what we are calling the state of the capital region. So our initial report was on housing, then we wrote about demographics, and then got subsumed by COVID and felt like we had to write a COVID addendum. Last year, we wrote about jobs, and this year we're writing out transportation. We expect to have a formal launch event in May, so you can keep your eye out for that. And if you'd like to get on our mailing list, send me an email. What we do at the center is produce policy relevant research on the capital region, sort of like what you're seeing today. Host events for the public on topical issues, which we look forward to doing upon the return to in-person events, train the next generation of students. And I would like to say that Chelsea Allinger, the director of Greater Washington, was in fact a student of mine in my class. And we are open to collaboration. So if you have thoughts on ways we could work together, I'm all ears. And I also wanted to say, from what the people at Greater Washington told me about people who are coming to this webinar, I think many of you are more in the weeds in transportation than I am. So what I'm going to try and do today is give you a 10,000-foot overview about issues that I think are important for transportation. And if you want to tell me that doesn't fit with how the VRE has to run given its legislative mandate, that's okay. And I'm happy to talk about that. So here's what I have to say. I think I wanted to start with the biggest pictures: who's going where, when, why, anyhow, and how are they getting where they're going. And I'm setting my timer, so I won't talk too long. But I think the biggest picture here is that without transportation costs, we would have no cities. If we lived in a world where it was costless to move people and ideas around, there would be no sense in having a city, because the city would give you no value. And cities formed to facilitate communication when communication was costly, if you want to think about the earliest era of cities. But what's interesting is that cities persisted and thrived even as you might think that communication costs dropped. And I'm not actually sure that's the right way to think about it. So certainly there are types of communication costs that dropped. And if you want to think about like the cost of communicating with your accountant, or the cost for a law firm of communicating with its back office. And as those costs declined, those functions moved out of cities to large part. They moved out of the dense urban areas and into sort of lower cost suburban or exurban areas. it's not really clear to me that other communication costs have actually declined. The costs of moving ideas between people or building relationships. We're in Washington. Relationships are critically important, I think, for all kinds of political machinations. It's not clear to me that the cost of building those relationships actually declined, and those are important and part of the reason we live in cities. So I think transportation has been definitional for cities. And I think a question we're all grappling with now is whether transportation will continue to define cities. And I don't have a crystal ball. What I'm going to tell you is things that I know from the recent past that might help us think about how we would expect cities and transportation to evolve. So given all that, I'm going to give you 3 big facts and 3 looming issues. So I'm going to just outline them here, and then I'll go through each of them. So the 3 big facts. First, driving remains the dominant mode of transport. That's true in Greater Washington. It's true throughout almost all the United States. Second, we construct most new housing in pretty transit unfriendly areas. And then third, the business model for on-demand transit remains, I think, what I could generously call hazy. I'm happy to talk more about that. But given those, I think those are the sort of 3 big things that define how we think about how we could provide transit in the future. So given that, these are the things that I think are not yet facts. I think we don't yet have a sense where people are going to work post-COVID. Like where is that going to be? And what is it going to look like? And then second, what can we expect in terms of transit transformation from the deep suburbs? And then third, what will future technologies do for transit? So I'm going to talk through all of these. So let me start with big fact number 1, which is that driving remains the dominant mode choice. So this is a graph showing you transportation mode choice by workers in the capital region, which is what we call the Greater Washington metropolitan area. And you can see that over 60% of commuters are in a car by themselves. Under 1 in 5 commuters take public transport of any type. And there's a substantial share of workers, and you'll see in particular counties, it's very large, that carpool. And then these other modes, people that don't commute, walk, or taxi, bike, motorcycle, are all quite small. This is that same picture, but for all counties in the Greater Washington area. So each bar is a county. The dark purple bar is the share taking car alone. And the third darkest purple bar is public transportation, which you can see in the District of Columbia is in the District of Columbia, something like slightly more than a quarter of commuters. So even in the districts, not more than about a quarter of commuters are taking public transportation. The top 3 counties here are what we call the urban counties in the region. The next 5 are our inner ring suburban counties. And then the last green counties there at the bottom are the exurban counties. And you can see that the farther you get from Washington, the more car dependent these suburbs become. Interestingly, that second bar, the second purple bar, the one between car alone and public transport, is carpooling. And you can see that carpooling is actually pretty important in a bunch of these exurban areas. It's non-trivial. Almost as many people carpool in some of these exurban areas as take public transit in the suburban areas. Now you might think, okay, well, you're telling me that public transit isn't so important, but maybe it's very important for a certain subset of people. So these are the people that we think would likely benefit most from transit, people who live below the poverty line. And let me put it this way, don't take this graph to say that people below the poverty line don't benefit from transit. But even for them, it's not a dominant mode choice. So even for people with incomes below the poverty line, that's people in the light. So we have all capital region residents in the dark purple and people with incomes below the poverty line in the lighter purple. And even for those people, about half of them commute to work by car. So car is still the dominant mode choice.
Leah, we have one point of clarification in the chat is what are the dates for your data?
Everything. Thank you for asking. Everything here is pre-COVID. This is all a pre-COVID world. We don't yet have these data for the post-COVID world. And I think it's just not clear how it's going to shake out. I don't know what that graph is going to look like in we know what it looked like. We have some guess about what it looked like in the past year. My guess would be that driving became an even more dominant mode choice for those people that actually went somewhere.
And
but
yeah, and I think it's important to note that it's still COVID, that we're not even post-COVID yet. So in some ways, I think that is a bit challenging. There was another question on your data sources.
Oh, all right. You guys are wonky. Everything I just showed you is from the American Community Survey, the most recent, pretty sure the most recent 5-year American Community Survey, which I'm pretty sure ends in 2019. And using the metropolitan area definition for Washington.
Great. I know that there are some points about data in here that I think will make for useful discussion questions. So for those of you that are noting that this is predominantly about travel patterns, because that's what ACS gives us, totally hear you. We can get into that later.
All right, happy to talk more. All right, so big fact number 2, most new housing is not easily served by transit. So if you're a transit professional, or even if you're not, you probably know that when you build transit and you make these really large fixed investments, the denser the better. And that high cost fixed investments, particularly like Metro, where you're building a rail station that you're not going to move, you've made this big fixed investment, you prefer it to serve as many people as possible. And that's better both for Metro and for traffic patterns, because you can get more people onto the train and off the roads. But we are not building housing in places. Our predominant housing building is not in places near Metro. So I'm just showing you a map of those urban, suburban, and exurban definitions I used before. So the blue are what we're calling urban jurisdictions, light blue suburban, and green exurban. Don't think of this as like a hard and fast line, just more as a way to get some understanding of how these different jurisdictions look differently. All right, so this is data again from a mix of census and the American Community Survey, showing where we have constructed new housing units between 2000 and 2016. This is from our first State of the Capital Region report. And you can see that the majority of new housing is constructed in exurban jurisdictions. And it's not that urban jurisdictions haven't contributed to new housing, but that the bulk of the new housing is built in exurban jurisdictions. So don't be fooled by all the cranes you see downtown DC. It's a lot of housing, but it's not the bulk of the housing. And you can divide this up by jurisdiction if you want to get a sense of where exactly this new housing is coming. And you can see that Loudoun County is the jurisdiction that produced the largest number of new homes in the greater Washington area over this 2000 to 2016 period. All right. And then big fact number 3, I think there was some optimism that on-demand transit like Uber, like Lyft, was going to be a savior for cities. And as somebody who took it, I mean, it was really cheap. It was great. I think it made possible a carless for you, let's say, urban lifestyle. But what, at least when I tell my students this, they are surprised, is that your Uber ride was never actually making money. Your ride was subsidized by the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, among other people. And newspaper articles say that you were paying something like 41% of the cost of your ride. So now that these investors are sort of asking Uber to make a profit, Uber's slower, it's more expensive, it's less reliable. So fewer drivers, less subsidy, which means lower overall volume, which means degraded service. All of which I take to think that we are far away from a functioning, profitable on-demand system. So I don't think, at least my read of the situation is that there's not an easy private sector solution here. Maybe you have thoughts differently. All right, so given all these facts, do you want to ask anything?
I was actually going to say that it might be worth a little bit of a meditation on why on-demand transit was so attractive, which is really sort of something that we have to pull apart at CWAS. Why is it attractive? It's because well, we know what's going on with Metro right now, and buses are not frequent and reliable. And that's true both in DC and outside of it. So I think that this is super interesting because it sort of points to the fact that Uber was probably more subsidized than transit is in the US, would be my guess. I don't have the numbers on that, but I would bet on that. And, I think the reason that it was attractive is because transit, people are always seeking better options and better alternatives. I've written this post many, many times for CWAS, basically is that all transit riders have a choice. Even your most dedicated, frequent riders will abandon systems that do not serve their needs. And, if Uber with, very, very subsidized trips was meeting people's needs in a way that transit was not, that became, really, really valuable. It wasn't just like this, like, oh, people like taking black cars, right? It was because like they came and they were affordable.
I think I was most compelled by things I read about people who had to use this like on-demand paratransit. And the on-demand paratransit was, it's really, really expensive, in my understanding, for transit systems to provide. And the quality wasn't so great. Like it took forever to come, and it would frequently get you where you were going late. And Uber was just a revolution. Like you could actually come when it said it was going to come. It cost the transit systems a fraction of what they used to be paying for their paratransit. It seemed sort of miraculous. So I mean, of course, if you're one of these, for those people who are getting sort of the worst product of the transit system, it just seemed like absolutely life-changing. And even for people who weren't getting the like slowest of the slow from transit systems, it just seems like exactly what you want, something that picks you up where you are and takes you where you want to go. That's what we want from transit, right? That's exactly what we want. And it wasn't even too expensive.
Yeah. And I'm noting Anne's comments in the chat. Metro is unreliable right now. Some people find buses super reliable. I have found that experience varies from person to person, which I think is like the core here is not just that Uber was a silver bullet, although I think many policymakers would have liked it to be a silver bullet, because like who isn't always looking for a silver bullet? Like who isn't looking for that? But when you have pretty uneven experiences, I had a very unreliable bus ride this weekend, and I'm a pretty dedicated rider. It's fine for me. I just walk to my destination, but that's not always tenable. And my job is both, professionally and personally believing in the bus. There's if people's experiences are uneven and they can't rely on that, or they're missing their transfer, then like those are real factors, and not everybody's a wonk. So
yes, I don't think we shouldn't expect people. So let me put it this way. My 8-year-old son loves to take transit. He would take transit just for the love of it. But I don't think that's what we want to expect people to do. We can't expect you to take the bus because you love it. We want you to take the bus because it gets you from point A to point B in a way that seems both economical and timely and reliable.
Yeah. Cool. So now that you've entertained my diatribes.
All right. So given those three facts, here are three issues. I'm not saying these are the only three issues, but three big issues I think we should keep in mind going forward about transportation. So first, where are we going to work? I think this remains a really open question, which I just don't think we know yet. So first, there's a set of blue collar jobs that are in person. Think a mechanic. The mechanic is always going to have to go and work at the garage. Then there's a set of white collar jobs that are in person. Now, before the pandemic, I had always viewed my job as a professor as being one of the most flexible jobs. But now I realize, now that everyone else is working from home, my job is now on the inflexible side, because I have to go to work and teach students. They prefer to see my face rather than my Zoom screen head. So there's a set of white collar jobs that require in-person activity. I went for a walk with a friend this morning who's a family law attorney. She has to be in person for some of the things she does. And this matters because your work location is a large determinant of your residential location. And that pair determines what kind of transit we need. So I think we need to understand, first how COVID is going to play out with work locations. That'll help us understand what it means for residential locations. And then that'll help us understand what kind of transit we need. And bottom line, I think it's just a really open question how many people are going to want to want to return to work downtown and return as many days a week as they were going before. So I I guess my expectation is that I would be stunned if we ever return to the prior volume of workers downtown, but I'd also be stunned if downtown immediately goes into extreme decline. I think we're headed somewhere in the middle. That's my best guess. Our current transit networks focus on delivery to the center. And if work patterns change so that delivery to the center is not what we want, that's a really, really expensive fix, part because the lines are going the wrong place, and in part because it's much easier to deliver people to one central location than it is to deliver them in a timely, reliable fashion to a set of dispersed locations. So I think whether we still need to get people to the center remains an open question, but what I can tell you is what people did pre-pandemic. So I'm going to show you a set of graphs about where people lived pre-pandemic. So these set of graphs are for the nation as a whole, but I actually did them first for the Greater Washington area. They look exactly the same. So this is not a story that's specific to the Greater Washington area. So let me explain how this graph works. It's a little convoluted. So on the x-axis, I divide neighborhoods within a metropolitan area into a population density rank. So Alex lives in neighborhood X, and it's among the most dense neighborhoods in the Greater Washington area. She's going to be her neighborhood is going to be on the far right of the graph. I live in probably a less dense neighborhood than Alex, but maybe I'm like at the 50th percentile. My neighborhood is in the 50th percentile. So these are within metro population density ranks, so that the densest place in New York is at the top of the graph, and the densest place in San Diego is also at the top of the graph, even though they differ in population density. And then on the y-axis, I am reporting the mean share of jobs with the potential to telework. So this is by people's residential location. So I'm showing you first the lowest people. These are neighborhoods of the lowest income quartile. So the neighborhoods with the 25% of neighborhoods with the lowest income, measured by neighborhood income. And what you can see is that regardless of how dense a place you live in, if you are in a neighborhood that's in one of these, in the 25% of lowest income neighborhoods, there's really no relationship between the density of your residential neighborhood and the likelihood your job has to telework. It's kind of the same for this second lowest quartile. There's kind of like a slight upward slope, very slight. Now we're getting above the median income, and now we're starting to see a relationship between the residential density of your neighborhood and the potential of your job to telework. And now I'm going to show you the top quartile, so the very wealthiest 25% of neighborhoods by income. So for these wealthiest neighborhoods, there's a really pretty strong relationship between the average ability of a job in that average ability of a worker in that neighborhood to telework. And this, I should say, this ability to telework is measured by jobs pre-pandemic. Like, what are the components of these jobs, and could that job be done via telework? It's not saying, is this job teleworking, but does this job have the potential to telework? And what you can see here is that for these wealthier neighborhoods, people who live among people who live in wealthier neighborhoods, there's a very strong relationship between the density of your residential neighborhood and the ability of your job to telework, which is interesting. It's saying people who had the greatest ability, I shouldn't say ability, I should say potential to telework, lived in places that were dense even before the pandemic. So either these people couldn't telework because their jobs wouldn't allow it, or these people chose to live in dense places anyhow, even though they had the ability to telework. And that's interesting, and it makes you a little bit hopeful for people's willingness to stay in dense locations when the pandemic hopefully recedes. But I want to point out that rich and poor are not evenly distributed across density levels in a city. So to show you this, I'm going to examine the distribution of each income group across that same measure of neighborhood density. And this picture is, again, that lowest income neighborhoods in the lowest income quartile. And what you can see, so if neighborhoods in the lowest income quartile were evenly distributed across the metropolitan area, we would have a straight line at that 1%, because we'd have to take all those 1%, they'd add up to 100. That would be the full distribution. And what you can see is that's not the case at all, that people in the lowest income quartile are underrepresented in very undense neighborhoods over here, and they're way overrepresented in very dense neighborhoods here. People in the second lowest income quartile, we have almost that flat line, I'd say, if they were evenly distributed across neighborhoods. And then people in the highest income quartile pre-pandemic were underrepresented in the two highest income quartiles were underrepresented here at the very densest part of metropolitan areas, which makes you think back to that other picture and think, oh, but remember those wealthy people, wealthy neighborhoods that had a lot of ability to telework. That is a very small set of all neighborhoods. So this picture, I think, makes me a little less optimistic about a return to density, at least by the wealthy. All right, so issue 2, can low density areas adjust? I think this is an issue with or without the pandemic. It's a long-term issue. Most people don't live in transit accessible areas, if you define that as the ability to commute, say, to downtown in a less than an hour. And I think when we think about transit, we want to keep in mind that car-like substitutes will be around for a long time to come. And that modern transport is most successful, you see this across the world, where there was past transport. Because past transport, when I say past transport, I'm not talking about transportation in the 1970s. I'm talking about transportation in this sort of golden era of transportation in the late 1800s and before the arrival of the cheap car. So this era from like the 1890s to maybe 1910, when people couldn't afford cars and cities were built in response to the transportation technology of the time, which was streetcars. And so they were built densely and with land use that supported streetcars. And what you see is that when we rebuild transit in cities, and this is not just a US phenomenon, that transportation is successful where there was past transport. So I have a paper that compares Jakarta, used to be called Batavia. This is Batavia, 1897, with Bogota. Here's Bogota, circa 1890. Batavia, now Jakarta, had a very limited tram system, and Bogota had trams that started running in 1884. They were electrified, had a large system. Its land use was largely determined by this tram system. Both of these cities in the early 2000s built bus rapid transit. If you're a transit aficionado, you'll know that Bogota's system is known across the world, as an icon of bus rapid transit. Whereas Jakarta's, I don't want to say it was a complete failure, but it was definitely, it is not known as an icon across the world. And part of the reason I argue you see this, at least the short run failure in Jakarta, is because it didn't have the land use infrastructure that Bogota had that supported bus rapid transit. So what does that mean for us here in the greater Washington area? In writing that paper, comparing Bogota and Jakarta, I tried to look for places that have made substantive changes to land use to support transit. I looked across the entire US, and I think that the most single compelling example of this is here in the greater Washington area in Fairfax County, Tysons. So Fairfax County planners made this great picture showing how they're trying to shift from the land use on the left to the land use on the right. We're somewhere in between these two now. And you can see what they're doing is taking these super blocks that were largely industrial use, rebuilding them, making streets where there didn't used to be streets, making pedestrian plazas, getting rid of a lot of road, putting parking underground. I don't think there's less parking, but there's not no parking. And so Fairfax is spending tons of money and political will on building this kind of walkable area out of suburban fabric. And I think it's just a really open, interesting question if this is still going to work. I read in the news the other day about a hotel company that was moving into the Pike and Rose development from its more suburban headquarters in Rockville, which made me think, and the Pike and Rose development is another sort of development like this one, which made me think, okay, well, if companies are still interested in moving to that kind of development, maybe there's more hope. But I would also say, like, if this kind of transformation can't work here, where there is a lot of money to spend, where there's political will to do this, where the business interests are also aligned in building transit, and where, importantly, as my husband pointed out to me, there were no pre-existing residents here to complain, at least right on this piece of land, about this kind of transformation. So if this can't work here, I think you should be very dubious about its ability to work anywhere. On that happy note, that's what, I have one more issue. So issue 3, future technologies in transit. So if you could get, and I think we've talked about this already, if you get and afford a driverless car to take you around, would you ever get back on the bus? Like what would make you get back on the bus if you could have an on-demand Uber to take you that was cheap, that would take you wherever you wanted to go? And then if that were the case, what does it mean for a metro? And I think that's just not clear. So it could mean that the options are so great that no one would ever ride the train again. Or it could mean that the options are so great that the traffic gets so bad that the train looks even better. They both seem like possibilities to me. And then how does that interact with the importance or lack thereof, as we still want to see, of central areas? So I think the jury's still out on what these future transportation on-demand technologies are going to do to transit. It could be bad, but I don't think it necessarily has to be. So thanks a bunch for having me, Alex. I'm happy to entertain all kinds of questions.
You are welcome. Thank you, Leah. That was super helpful and clarifying for me. I think a good place to start actually is a question from Kevin, which is, I think, worth reading in full. While canvassing out in Loudoun years ago, I was amazed by the density of small garden apartments occupied by apparently low-income folks. When will Loudoun and similar communities be redefined as an urban environment? I have my own philosophy around this, but you do the data.
Well, so it is totally a fair point. I think in our data, not for a good long time, because our data measures, even at the neighborhood level, population density. And it's something to keep in mind. It's something we can actually look at. How many exurban neighborhoods approach urban densities? My guess is very few. So even if you have an urban level density in a sea of suburban level density, I think you're going to behave more like the suburban level density than the urban level density.
Yeah, my answer would track with that similarly. Is, I use where I grew up as an anecdote for a lot of stuff, which is Severna Park, Maryland, which is not in the DC region, but just outside of it. It's actually closer to DC than a lot of further out, Loudoun, Prince William, Warren, all that stuff. There are apartments in the town that I grew up in, although very, very few. It is zoned majority single family, and the county itself is oriented towards that sort of like exurban sprawl kind of environment. So even if you do have pockets of higher density, that doesn't necessarily make it urban. What it probably is just sort of an anomaly. And if we're looking at that path dependency for transit, which I think is true, that's just realistic, then it's not something that is likely to infill. I think that brings us into sort of like another question from Katie, who asked, when you say transit is very expensive to fix from current downtown routes to alternate destinations, is this only referring to rail? Wouldn't buses be much cheaper to change routes?
Oh yeah, so I agree with you. So I agree 100%. The bus routes would be much cheaper to change than rail. I also think that people are less willing, developers, but also people are much less willing to make fundamental investments in cities based on buses for exactly that reason. Because if you don't like where the bus is moving, you could just go around and move the bus. Whereas that if the metro area has spent $1 billion building out this rail system, it's not going to spend another $1 billion moving it 5 blocks away. So I think people are willing to make investments based on rail that they're just not going to make based on the bus, unless you've added some hardscape, which then makes the bus immobile and expensive.
Yeah, the way to, I think, not just from the sort of like development financing standpoint, but also for riders, is that like dedicated bus lanes are a critical feature into getting the bus to work better. Dedicated lanes, dedicated signals, the whole suite of stuff that doesn't just make buses more permanent, but also makes them better for riders because it prioritizes them over driving. That's actually, it's cheaper than rail for sure, but it's not that much cheaper. And it comes with the very expensive political calculus of like, if we're talking especially about like outer Loudoun or outer Montgomery County, there have been some inroads on that. There have been some changes. They're on, maybe one route, right? Like that's not, that is slow moving in similar ways to rail. So I think it's interesting about, how those run in parallel. So that's, I think, the answer for Katie there. I think from both sides of financing and also transit planning and organizing, it's hard. The bus lanes are not easy. DC is funding its bus priority program. It's a long time CWAS ask. We're super excited about it, but it was also a surprise. It's not easy. It's not that much cheaper. There are costs in other places. Let me see if there's a good way to segue here. We have a lot of questions that are sort of grouping around talking about trips that are not work trips. So, yes, definitely ACS data is work trips. I think most people on here are very familiar with the fact that you can only really select your main mode. Really, shakes out like multimodal commuters in this conversation, which is frustrating. So
okay, I think the graphs I showed about how we have these wealthy neighborhoods, very dense neighborhoods where people have the ability to telecommute. I think those neighborhoods are all about trips that are not like why people are living in those neighborhoods is largely trips that are not work related. Why do people live in Georgetown or Foggy Bottom? It might be in part because of a shorter commute to work, but it's also in part because you can have these non-work trips to things that you would like to do. So I think that's critically important. And I think you're absolutely right that you can't measure that with census data. I think you have to turn to other data sources. There are some new interesting data sources coming online that can help us understand where people go when it's not for work. But I still do want to say that I think people's residential location, at least in the past, and we'll see in the future, is largely driven. I mean, I think in the future it's still going to be true, is driven by your work location. And if your work location is at home, that opens up a different set of residential locations for you. And if your work location is, an actual physical work location you have to go to, that also determines a set of residential locations. So the work commute is, I would say, centrally important, though these other trips importantly factor in as well.
One thing that I've been thinking a lot about, and as part of the recovery conversation, is that especially for more high income earners who are white collar and able to work from home, is that in some ways, like, and this is sort of more DC specific because that's where I live and I work from home, so that's what I'm observing. But that the neighborhoods are going to do really well, and that's going to be downtown DC doesn't have people living in it. That there's like that's going to be a real challenge. I mean, that's been an ongoing policy issue for the district, but I think you'll maybe see that replicated in other areas, whether that be Pike and Rose or Tyson's, where you can be, on top of a grocery store and on top of a metro station, and not necessarily, you can go downtown if you need to, but that you don't necessarily have to. And I think that has sort of helped me wrap my head around, in absence of census data that can tell us how people are moving around for non-work trips, is like, that's now kind of the framework that I've been thinking about, is like what happens when like the neighborhoods are actually like not even it's not a renaissance, it's not any of that stuff, none of those like super hackneyed terms from like the way that we talked about urban development in the 80s, but like that, like, people live in them, they can work from their homes, their daytime economy is pretty solid. What sort of like, how does that factor into some of this like conversation around places?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm an economist, so the place I would look to see what's going on is in commercial rents. So like I was downtown yesterday, and a lunch place I used to go to that, when I went at 1 p.m., I'd usually have a hard time finding a seat. There were 3 people sitting down and I was one of them. I just can't see how that place I don't see how it's ever going to pay the rent it was paying pre-pandemic. So I think those rents have to fall, or I think they either have to fall. We'll see a lot of businesses, as we've already seen, but maybe more going out of business. And then, if we do see this neighborhood renaissance, we'll see rents rising in these sort of more local places that people can go during the day. The other places that strike me as being big gainers are the food places that can either deliver the food or make food for delivery, because it seems like sometimes people do not want to leave their house when they are at their house. So, but that still benefits, I think, local business for the food delivery.
Yeah. I think we could probably talk all day about like how well can you plan when you really only have access to data around work trips, which is something that I hope is changing going forward. But that seems very pressing for a lot of our commenters.
Oh, okay. So hey, commenters, you can text me, but there's these safe graph data that at least they let academics use that let you look at people's behavior patterns, and I thought about using them here to think about where people go. Alex, you're frozen to me. Since Alex is frozen for me, I'm going to keep talking just in case she got cut off. I'm going to look at the Q&A. I think we can expect to learn better about what people do from these safe graph data, understand where they're going for non-work trips. There's a question about about whether we can see differences by race, gender, and time of departure. So women traveling early in the morning or late PM commuters. So I think that's super interesting question. And it's one I can't answer with these data. The data I'm using don't allow me to look by time of day. I think I can look, but I am pretty sure I can look by race, which I didn't do for this presentation, but which I can do. I think what you would see is a pattern similar to the pattern I showed you for poor commuters, where we see still preponderance of car commuting, but a greater use of public transit. Okay. A question, I'm looking at the Q&A. Are there early data on bus route reliability, ridership improvements on dedicated bus route lanes on 14th Street? And then how impactful would these dedicated lines be if they morph into rideshare parking lanes? I don't, my guess would be that it's too early to evaluate these bus improvements in the sense that we don't have a full sort of quorum of commuters, or what might be a full quorum of commuters if we ever go back to the office. Going back to the office, I think like the true evaluation of their success has to hold until then. Let me keep looking in the Q&A. A question about whether Uber reduced the volume of car ownership in urban areas. I think there's some evidence that it did, but I think there's also, I think that's just that may have been a short-term blip, given the weird subsidy of Uber. A person saying, I'm in College Park, most of my neighbors are blue collar contractors. You're not going to see them. You're not going to get them to ride Metro. Cars are part of their culture. I don't see that changing anytime soon. If I were a contractor, I wouldn't take Metro either, because you have to get to work and you have to be there exactly at time, and you have stuff to bring. Like for people who have like actual physical stuff to take to their jobs, I don't think Metro is going to be a solution for them. And I don't think we should reasonably expect it to be. And I don't think we should try. I think building a system that would help a contractor take his stuff to a job is so expensive for Metro. I can't see that being worthwhile. I think where Metro can stand to gain are in places that we can densify near existing stops, or riders that were turned off maybe in the past by poor quality who could be reattracted. So another comment, highway access congestion pricing in Virginia is totally regressive policy socioeconomically. Who but the affluent can pay $20 to drive work and home daily? So I concur with your visceral reaction to the congestion pricing. But I think it's also true that congestion pricing, there's research that shows that congestion pricing makes the remaining lanes on the freeway better for everybody else. And if that's the case, then, it's not obvious that the person paying $22 is harming you by going in the fast lane. You might be better served by them paying $20 and you being able to go faster on the freeway, unless you're the person who's paying $22. Caitlin, do you want to step in? I'm just answering some questions.
Yeah, no, I just thought I'd join you as a conversant in that respect. And I think, to some extent, part of this kind of congestion pricing question comes down to availability of carrots along with sticks. It's clearly more aggressive to charge when you don't have a good option. But in places where there are good options, I think there's some creativity and maybe flexibility possible. Just looking at those questions. Interesting question. Frederick Wag has kind of raised women using transit differently. I don't know if anything, Leah, you can kind of, and by the way, hi everyone, I'm Caitlin Rogger. I'm Deputy Director at CWAS. I don't know if Leah, you could kind of touch on the transit and women on transit patterns you know anything about?
I honestly know very little about this. I think I don't know I am unfamiliar with the current data about women in transit. Alex, you made it back. I don't want to speak to that. I think what we can look at, I think we can look at this to some degree in the census in the pre-COVID data, but I think we know that women have different types of jobs on average than men do. And that's going to lead us to different transit commuting patterns. And we also know that there are a certain set of blue collar jobs that are largely male that commute by car that we just will never expect to observe women in. But more than that, I don't have anything else to say.
Yeah, for me, I have only anecdoted to share during the COVID period that I'm seeing kind of women and maybe particularly mothers return less to downtown areas. I only have my own guesses as to why that is, but certainly we're definitely seeing more kind of burdens on caregivers at home, which of course are not just women and mothers, but a variety of people. And I think that there's a really interesting possible impact to kind of look out for in terms of who's returning and why.
Yeah, and I think in the long run, the big policy question is there something we should adjust in our transit system to make sure that we're serving everyone as best we can? The problem is that adjusting the transit system when your backbone is Metro Rail is no cheap endeavor. Alex, anything else you want to ask since you made it back?
Well, thank you everyone for being patient. I suppose I could ask about the economic impact of your internet going out when you work from home.
So I think this is actually this huge question. I have a friend who, the friend I went walking with this morning, bought a cabin in the woods. The cabin is actually not it has inadequate internet for work. So I think we very rarely hear this from people in the greater Washington area, but I think there's a limit to how far you could move out if you don't have accessible internet. Because the internet is what makes you able to work, if you are working from home, makes you able to work from home. Without the internet, it's a non-starter.
Well, I think that brings us back to your first slide about communication costs, right? We have cities because communication costs would be too great, and then the communication costs become transportation costs. I didn't expect to be the anecdote for that, so thank you everyone for your patience. As a result, I also no longer have the collective Q&A responses, but I do know that we had some requests to talk about the East-West divide, and I, with respect, there was not much more specificity than that. But Leah, would you like to talk about the East-West divide?
I presume what you mean is and you tell me if this is wrong, Alex, the east-west wealth divide, that we've got more wealth, more jobs, more economic growth on the west and the east. Is that, oh, Alex is frozen again. So I'm gonna assume that's the case.
That's correct, Leah.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure that I would, even though I like to attribute many things to transportation, I'm not sure I would attribute that to transportation. And though I suppose you could look to transportation as a policy solution to make some of these areas more viable. So I know that Prince George's County is interested in making development near the metro. And I think what's going to be difficult for them in the post-pandemic era is if there's a drop off in demand for location near transit, I suspect it's going to be more for stations in Prince George's County than it will be for stations near the new Silver Line. So it will probably bite for those in Prince George's County harder than it will for those in Fairfax County. But I still think over the long run, it's likely to be an asset. Those station areas are likely to be an asset for Prince George's County. Oh, you're muted, Alex.
Well, I was going to say what's been happening sort of with, especially the, Prince George's, is that in many ways, Tyson's has been this sort of focus for infill and like moving in that direction, even just, by virtue of being called an edge city, I think benefited from a level of attention that was not granted to Prince George's for reasons that are racialized, economic for sure. So in the same way that, you sort of have energy and attention paid, that creates those longer standing grooves in some ways that you also see with fixed rail transit. That I find that, disappointing, but not shocking. And I think that will probably play into what gets built there over time. So, we have about 3 minutes left. The questions keep coming, which is awesome. It has been really, really amazing to have such a well-attended webinar with such smart discussion. We're definitely not going to be able to get to everything. For those of you who asked, this will be recorded and we will distribute this. I was, anticipating ending on a what's going to happen with cities, but my earlier point about this actually still being we're still in a pandemic, the data's not here yet. I don't think it's really, everybody wants answers, but I think we're not at a point where we can have them. So I think there are sort of two outstanding questions. One for me is what happens when you have Metro Rail running every 30 minutes? What needs to happen there? And I think we had some questions about highways in the chat also, which those seem to me to be parallel questions about any thoughts about the 274-95 stuff, continuing a pace in some ways at the same time that Metro feels like it's really on the floor.
Okay, so I think maybe the most positive way to look at what's happening for Metro is to say, thank God this is happening during a period of low demand, so that, the system can somehow sort of limp along, offering trains every 30 minutes, and people are dissatisfied but not about to kill themselves. Whereas if you could have imagined this 2 years ago at this time, I don't know what Metro would have done. I mean, you remember probably those 1 or 2 days when Metro shut down its entire system because of safety concerns, and it was chaotic. And it's interesting because you see in the graphs that not that many people, 20% of workers maybe are taking, and that's a high estimate. So it's, under 20% of workers are taking Metro Rail to work. But the impact of those people not taking Metro Rail is pretty catastrophic. Our system is built for those, 15% of people to be on Metro Rail. And when they are not, it has impacts on everybody, even, the non-Metro Rail riders. So I think the silver lining of this, hopefully ending soon, Metro disaster, is that maybe they can figure out a way to get trains back on tracks while people are still have increasing interest in getting downtown. So I think that's point one. And then you also said sort of big picture what's happening in cities, and I want to concur. Oh, the second thing was about highways. I don't view these two things as being opposed per se. I mean, they're opposed only in the sense that they both cost money, and you know, you have a limited, everybody everywhere has a limited number of dollars they can spend on things. But I don't think we have to necessarily view highway improvements and metro improvements as an either or situation. I think particularly when you look at the number of people who commute by car, I think we have to reasonably thinking about ways we can improve transit for them as well.
I think that makes sense. And I guess we have to end on the sort of CWAS topic of the day, which is road pricing. You know, how does, at a time when, you know, a downtown economy might be fragile, but we also know that there is limited money, and in order, you know, one of the ways to get people to ride public transit is to have better public transit and less driver congestion. Road pricing has been pretty kicked around prominently recently. Interim Director Watt, during his confirmation hearing for the district, said he was in support of that on Tuesday. You know, there's a little bit of a groundswell with this, I think, especially because New York is getting moving. Are things too fragile for that right now, or does it have the potential to work?
Well, I would say the problem is that for congestion pricing, you need congestion. And we don't have enough. I mean, it's terrible to say, but there's not enough. I don't think there's enough congestion right now. Like you need congestion to price it, and if you don't have congestion, there's nothing to price. I think of an example from LA, where for years people in Beverly Hills were adamantly opposed to a subway through Beverly Hills, and then traffic got worse. It got worse enough that people were like, oh, well, you know, maybe it'd be okay if we had a subway. Yeah, there was still a set of people who were opposed to it, but there's a set of people like, well, you know, maybe it would be helpful. But, you know, traffic, like, my view is that traffic had to get bad enough, and it, you know, it just wasn't bad enough. So in some perverse way, maybe we have to wait for things to return to their normal bad level before I think we can have a political will for congestion pricing.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I mean, so much of this is about people's actual material experiences and how that ends up manifesting in politics. The data is really useful. You know, I said in a tweet about this that I definitely use the State of the Washington Region report to just like wrap my head around the fact that like there's more than just my neighborhood. We live in a region. But you know, so much of this stuff does happen because people with certain levels of experiences or certain experiences are in the position to make decisions, and we can influence that on the advocacy side. But so much of that does come down to somebody's material experiences and what that motivates them to do. So we're at 12:03. Leah, this was fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone. We will follow up. This has been recorded. I am sorry for my absence. I will now be thinking a lot about communication costs and transportation costs and yelling at my internet provider, but kindly, because this is a tough time to work for everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, and thanks to all the great questioners.
Yeah, we're going to be doing 2 more of these before the end of the year. We don't have dates yet, but they will be in November and December. So for those of you who were here, stay tuned, join us. If not, watch the recordings, and hope to hear from you all soon. If you need anything, email us. It's the best way to get in touch with CWAS staff, not Twitter, not other sort of formats, but be sure to send us an email. I'm abaca@ggwash.org. Reach out to us if you have any questions. Thanks, Leah.
Thank you, Alex.
All right, bye.